I'm speaking from Braddon, Canberra, which is located on Ngunnawal land. I also acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands upon which each audience member is located. Welcome to our webinar on Big Data with your host, John Lawrence from Downer Defence Systems. In this COVID-19 world in which we live, more and more emphasis has been placed on technological solutions. From testing techniques, broad spectrum antibiotics and vaccines through to tracing applications, trillions, at last count when I checked, it was 9 trillion US, according to estimates by the IMF, are being spent globally to combat this epidemic. Underpinning these solutions is lots and lots of data, which is contributing, to the pre-existing rapid growth in big data. As a world-class integrated services provider, Downer Group helps customers find solutions by leveraging leading insights and solutions across transportation and infrastructure, mining, energy, and industrial and public sectors. With me today, most of whom are at an acceptable physical distance, and I think none are from Victoria, Radi Kovacevic, Dr. Simon Longstaff, Professor Monica Whitty, and Matt Wilson. Welcome all.
Thank you. Good to be here.
So, Radi Kovacevic is the Chief Information Officer, Australian Department of Home Affairs. In this role, Radi oversees branches including intelligence, identity and biometric systems, visa, citizenship and digital systems, and traveller, cargo and trade systems. It's quite a lot. Prior to this role, he served as the Assistant Secretary, Major Capability Division at Home Affairs, headed up the gov.au team in the Digital Transformation Agency, and was the Chief Information Officer for the Department of the Prime Minister and Cabinet, with responsibility for all digital services. So welcome, Radi. Dr. Simon Longstaff is one of Australia's most well-known philosophers and the Executive Director at the Ethics Centre, a position which he has held since 1991. He's also an Honorary Professor at the Australian National University, a Fellow of CPA Australia, the Royal Society of New South Wales and the Australian Risk Policy Institute. Serves on a number of boards and committees and is the Independent Integrity Advisor to the Australian Taxation Office. Dr. Longstaff is also an Adjunct Professor at AGSM at University New South Wales Business School. So welcome, Simon. Professor Monica Whitty is the Director of Research Cyber at University of New South Wales, Canberra, where she also holds a chair in Human Factors and Cyber Security. As a cyber psychologist, her research focuses on how people behave, form relationships, construct identities, communicate and deceive others in digital spaces. Professor Whitty is also a member of the World Economic Forum Cyber Security Centre and a visiting professor in cyber security at Royal Holloway, University of London. So welcome, Monica. And last but not least, Matthew Wilson is the Executive Director, National Security at Downer Defence Systems. Prior to taking on this role in 2020, he was a management consultant for KPMG and spent more than 14 years as an intelligence professional with the Australian intelligence community. The last 6 years of which were in leadership positions managing teams responsible for strategic and policy advice, stakeholder engagement, relationship management, and complex negotiations in Australia and overseas. Welcome, Matt. We're probably standing a bit too close, but hey,
Take the risk.
We'll take the risk. Look, to get things going, I'll start off with you, Monica, if that's okay. I have a question for you. As with all new technology, there are both exciting opportunities and real threats to individuals and society as a whole. Whether the introduction of the telephone and the perceived negative effects on literacy, or the advent of the automobile and resultant ongoing loss of life, think Ralph Nader, there are costs and benefits to consider. As a psychologist, what are the implications of social media on our relationships, mental health, and the development of our children's identity and the ability to rebel and innovate? I thought I'd start you up with an easy one.
Yeah, definitely. The life, the universe and everything. Well, I guess I've been doing research in this area for a long time, and there's both the pluses and the minuses. And COVID-19 has probably borne out in our lives a lot more about that technology in our lives. The advantages are we can connect with people a lot more, a lot quicker, and we can self-disclose and discuss intimate issues about ourselves, which actually for kids and adolescents, that can be a great advantage because they can learn about themselves potentially in a safe environment. On the flip side, of course, that a lot of our communication is recordable when we're doing things online, so then they stick, and so things that are not helpful, harassing language perhaps, they stay, and so when bullying happens, then it remains online and becomes even more severe, those repercussions. I guess there's some interesting things that have been happening over time that I've observed in this area too, so that one can develop very strong, intimate relationships with others online, and that's not a bad thing. But of course, criminals can exploit that as well, right? So a lot of the work that I've done over the years has looked at romance scams and other types of scams. And so criminals can create a fake relationship and actually make people believe that they're really who they, claiming to be, as a genuine person that genuinely loves another individual, and eventually steals a lot of money from them, including people mortgaging houses for these criminals. So there's this two flip sides of the coin, I guess, in brief, to answer your question. Great things, but also, some costs as well.
Actually, and that's probably a good point to bring you in, Simon. So there are lots of reports on scenarios where individuals and entire societies at risk of being further marginalised, and maybe the young and the elderly is sort of, and certain ethnicities have been sort of highlighted as being at greater risk to COVID. But is there also is this move to the online space exacerbating those inequities, or and if you accept that, the future, there's that saying, the future is already here, it's just not very evenly distributed. Do you think we're entering a period where inequality is increasing as a result of big data?
Yeah, I think we already have done that. I mean, we already understand that there is a need for equitable distribution of core goods that enable people to make real decisions and to flourish in their lives. And whether it's because of location, or whether it's because of economic status, or whether or not it's to do with a combination of issues such as those that might enable or deny education. There's a range of things themselves that can either give you access to enabling technologies or prevent it. And to the extent that these technologies are going to become more ubiquitous in their role that they play, all the way from the things that Monica was talking about through to economic engagement, or even engagement as citizens, which you can see starting to occur. If you deny one group as opposed to another a reasonable degree of access, if you like a minimal degree of access, then you also deny them access to those basic goods. So it's a fundamental issue of justice, and what I suspect will happen, unless we consciously decide otherwise, is that many of the historical sources of inequity will be replicated in this area, just as they have been in the earlier times.
And actually and I'd like to pick up on that a bit later, actually, Simon, is that the inequities also from an economic standpoint. But handing over to you, Righty. So Scott McNeely, CEO of Sun Microsystems, said, "You have zero privacy anyway, get over it." Or in the words of Larry Ellison, "Privacy is dead," quote unquote. So you have a particularly interesting perspective on all this. So it doesn't matter that you're being watched when buying groceries without being told. As someone who relies on data to make informed decisions about who can come into the country and all sorts of very profound, far-reaching decisions to ensure a, quote, prosperous, secure, open and united Australia, is privacy in the 21st century misunderstood and or overrated? Aren't we putting ourselves at a disadvantage as a country if we aren't more open to this?
Fantastic question. Not an easy one either to answer, but we know that privacy is being considered essentially the shepherd of liberty. So the less you know about me, the less you know of what interactions I've had, with whom and when, the less you can interfere with me and my liberty. I think privacy is not dead. We spend, on one hand, we spend so much time on social media, enacting, using applications, systems, online shopping. I think one recent report actually raised that if you go online and shop, you're effectively sharing your data with over 300 different organisations. So in one instance, in the private sector, we're pretty free in some respects in terms of how we engage with our systems and our IT. Whilst on the other hand, government, and I speak on behalf of government, ranks pretty poorly in terms of trust. We take privacy very, very seriously. I'd argue that it's misunderstood. you know, just in terms of context and in terms of that, you know, prosperity, unity and security of our nation, over 50 million people crossed our borders last year. 60 million consignments, cargo and mail shipments were undertaken. And we're the second largest collector of revenue for government as well, in terms of prosperity, tourism and other things like that. On top of that, we've got, you know, the complexity of the dark web, the deep web, identity theft, which contributes to $2 billion annually. And we really do need to do something about that. And that's part of our mission, prosperity, security and unity. I'd have to say I don't want to be watched when walking into a shopping mall or undertaking my groceries personally without knowing what it's for. Legislative frameworks essential in terms of understanding, and in terms of government. We're actually in the Home Affairs portfolio governed by 55 acts and 400 legal frameworks, provisions effectively. Overseen by a commissioner, an information commissioner, an intelligence commissioner, and others. And at a time when we're collecting more data, more information, it becomes, you know, vitally more important. Your point around privacy and the future, good point. I think we're challenged in government at the moment. We have the careful balancing act of efficiency and convenience with privacy. We all want our shopping, online shopping to arrive before Christmas safely. We all want to effectively, we don't want to line up in long lines in airports. We want to feel safe when traveling through airports. And one day we all want to travel soon as well. And that requires data and information to be provided, shared, both nationally and internationally. And I think that's our challenge over the next 5 to 10 years. Is privacy dead? No, absolutely not from a government perspective. And I think it's a big challenge going forward.
Yes, it is. And Matt, so we're seeing quite a shift occurring as a result of COVID-19, and some might see it for the good in terms of remote working and other things. And there are a lot of opportunities out there which you sort of touched on, so autonomous vehicles and better services and delivery. So I would summarize it as saying, as taxpayers, we want to pay less tax, but as consumers, we see this whole variety, this plethora of online services that we'd like to make the most of. So given your knowledge of government and security, what are the opportunities for Australians in the 21st century? I mean, we're 20 years in, so we've still got 80 years to go.
Yes, that's right. So yeah, that's a really interesting one too. And I think about it in terms of probably a more macro, I'll answer that in a more macro way. So I think there's been lots of commentary, particularly in the last few years, about whether Australia as a country is embracing the opportunity that AI offers. So, which to the global economy is estimated to be something like 23 billion by 2030, right? Whereas Australia in 2019, I think the government invested something like 30 million over 4 years. Wow. Which is just a pittance compared to a lot of our countries overseas. So France, $2 billion, South Korea, $2 billion, even Canada, 130 million, and similar for Denmark, other countries similar size over a similar period. So I guess my key concern is, are we positioning ourselves as a country to really take advantage of all the opportunities that AI offers? Yeah. It doesn't, I think, just by virtue of the government investment, it doesn't seem like that. We have we're world leaders in research, in AI research. You have some of the best researchers going around, some of the best universities and programs to, help develop the technology. What we don't have is the investment in the industry, the support to industry to take advantage of that. And I guess maybe the encouragement and the legislative governance and legislative provisions to help enable that, perhaps. So we see a lot of this great IP and great companies having to go overseas to realise the dream or to get their technology out to market. And I think I worry about that not only as a consumer or as a public citizen, but from a government point of view who needs to access particular technologies to stay ahead of the curve. And that could be for security reasons. It's getting increasingly difficult because a lot of that is overseas based. And then that produces its own challenges for us as a nation getting access to, being able to trust it, and things like that. So, look, you know, it might sound a bit doom and gloom, but I think that's the reality we're in, and I see a lot of people trying to push for greater investment, greater support to industry, and I'm just not seeing the movement on that, to be honest.
Well, and there was an interesting show I saw the other day on television where someone, Chinese national, was talking about big data being the oil of the 21st century.
Yep.
And obviously there are different systems and different government systems where they can just go in and scoop up any of the data that they like. But if that's true, then you could argue that, I mean, my view is that Australians, we can do whatever we set our minds to. At the end of the day, we're 0.33% of the global population. Yep. So, you know, how do we, as you say, how do we take advantage of that? Maybe, Simon, how do you see this? I mean, it's an interesting balancing act, and I note that today is the 1st of July, and this is when CDR kicks in for certain banking products. So this is it's a bit like, to me, it sort of feels a bit like the phone number portability. I'm showing my age a bit here, but now we can start taking our data around. So, yeah, do you see that? You know, I guess there could be criticisms here about you know, some of these ethics considerations that getting in the way of prosperity and progress.
I don't think that's right. I think, if anything, what we know from the past is that if you fail to attend early to the ethical issues, you destroy value and you destroy opportunity. And I think there's just one word I can use to tell the tale. It's Monsanto. They were there leading in the development of another form of technology, genetically modified organisms, and they completely failed properly to deal with the ethical questions. And for that reason alone, they destroyed massive amounts of value, and they actually delayed the deployment of a technology that could have had considerable good for humankind more generally, let alone for issues of prosperity. So I think those people who think just let the horses run and we'll round them up, you know, when they've done enough damage and we'll then bring them back to the stable, are completely misunderstanding the appropriate way you approach this. I just want to go back to a couple of things that have been mentioned and tie them together, particularly what Radi was saying about the importance of privacy and its connection to liberty. You've got to remember, human beings, for the most part, have not had a long history of privacy. We've lived in small communities, you know, roaming bands, towns and things like that, where people always knew what you were doing. They just had to look over the fence. The thing that's different now is that we have no way of knowing the context within which observations about our lives are taking place, and how that absence of context in terms of who it is and why they're doing it and what use they might put. So it takes something and it gives us a concern that very powerful technologies have the capacity then to be deployed in ways which control us, restrict our liberty, and in fact are against our interests. And that's where Radi's other point about the relative low trust that's invested in government. Despite all of that legislation that he mentioned, you still have low trust. It's like the Monsanto case. If you don't trust the people who are building and deploying the technology, then you're not going to let them take as many risks as they could, even if you believe that it could ultimately be for your benefit. So I think what we have to do is say to the people who are developing these technologies, build the ethics in at the beginning. Build it in at the design stage, at its deployment stage, in the same way that you're going to release it, just as you do with things like pharmaceuticals and others. Build the confidence of people that the technology has got within its very structure the capacity to perform as we would want it to do, and to serve, at least if it's in the hands of government, the public good, and I would say even if it's in the hands of the private sector. Because if we don't do that, then we will not secure the benefits that have just been discussed as possible, because of basically a sense of the potential ethical failure that would otherwise occur.
Yeah, it's interesting, Simon. You reminded me also of the whole Cambridge Analytica scenario where they used massive amounts of data that they had access to, combined with quite in-depth behavioural, psychological analytics to affect behavioural change. So their whole business model was about affecting behavioural change for the gain of the people they worked for. And it started with working for the government to influence, whether it was Taliban or things like that, to act a certain way, all the way to influencing elections throughout the world. And I guess one of the things I sort of learned of that whole episode was, there was a comment that, well, this was almost an event that had to happen to allow, because technology moves so quickly, that something like this had to happen so that we could institute the protections and make put the, I guess, ethical walls or boundaries across it that we want to as a society. So I'd be keen to understand how do we keep up with putting those, how do we know what's right or the way to act? Given technology moves so quick, how can we keep ahead of that, I guess, is sort of the question.
Well, from my view, you don't try and do that. What you do is, if you start with some core principles and you make them consistently applied, what you then do is you provide the freedom to technologists to innovate and to do things differently and to move at speed, but you do hold them accountable for giving practical effect to those principles, and for that being able to be assured. So you actually want somebody who is disinterested, independent, coming and looking at this and say, can you prove to me that the core principles we agreed ought to inform the design and development are present and active? You may have done something completely innovative, completely different, moving at great speed, but you must at least assure us that that is present. And I think that's how you start doing it, rather than trying to tie everything down to these very narrow templates. You go on a principles-based approach.
Yeah.
And Simon, just to add to that one, that's something that we're actually looking to internally as well, in terms of some of our broader internal governance arrangements, principles-based. We acknowledge that technology is moving at an extremely rapid pace. And I think one of the challenges for government for us at the moment is agile policy and legislative reform. We're not going to be able to slow the juggernaut. And I think there'll be a pretty different world post-COVID-19. And I think we're still at the very early cusp of Industry 4.0. I think with more data being collected from various sources at different velocities, we're going to have to look at how do we apply more agile policy, legal reforms, and how do we get things into Parliament quicker?
Yeah, I think the estimates, Righty, is something like and 20 odd zettabytes were produced last year globally, according to the World Economic Forum, and that's forecast to, that's just going up exponentially. So you're right, it is a bit of a juggernaut. So Monica, there's some really good questions coming through here. I'd like to sort of send your way. There's a zinger here from Brendan that was sent the other day, which was about, it touches on what we're talking about before. There's an element of uninformed hypocrisy or naivety exhibited by people protesting the storage of data by government agencies, whilst freely consenting to storage of private data by social media outlets. And this is sort of, and there's another question here which we just received from Karina Watt. Sorry, for Simon and Karina, what is the sorry, a question for Simon, but if you can have a look at this first or respond to this first. What is the public good? Is it different from the common good and public interest? And here's a question actually for you. And a question for Monica, can you provide any insights into why the general public seem far more eager to provide personal information to private social media companies under the government, which is really what Righty was talking about before? Why don't people trust government, but they'll trust these private entities like Monsanto and that to do the right thing?
Yeah. Well, I guess there's a couple of answers to all of this, and I guess none of it's easy, but in terms of why would you give information to a company that actually may not trust as much as a government? That's not unreasonable to think about. So why would humans trust that instead of government? Well, government hasn't been trusted for over the years, actually, over these issues, and not just in Australia, but in other countries as well. And when trust is broken, it's very hard to repair, right? So people see government as not the experts in security. We see security breaches, and we see announcements from government sometimes when a security breach hasn't happened, but claiming that it has happened. So when you start to think, well, does the government know what they're doing? Are they the experts in this? Then people start, that trust does seem to wane. I guess another of the issues that I'm thinking about when I'm listening to everyone is that as a psychologist, it's really interesting that humans are blamed in a lot of this stuff too, and making these decisions. And even as we've been talking about technical people and how they can, put in the ethics in this, and how they can harness this technology for our economic gains and all the rest. And also they have to develop the security to make sure our organizations don't go bust from a security, breach. But actually what we really need to be doing as a nation is educating the whole nation around this stuff, right? And education is not just about raising awareness, it really is upping the whole nation's skill base in this area, so that we don't just rely on the technical people to get all this right, that all of us can have some kind of skills and understandings in developing and utilizing this technology, and as well as protecting our own spaces at home and in our workplaces as well. So I guess in short, let's look at the people in all this and upskilling us as well. Government needs to have a bit more of a role in that, especially with small businesses as well. Why don't we trust them? I'm not saying that we shouldn't trust government, but this is why people don't trust government, is once it's broken, it's really hard to repair.
I think there's another reason, a couple of reasons, and I'll come to Karina's question in a moment. I think the thing about governments, of course, in a modern state is that they make an exclusive claim for the legitimate use of force or coercion. So you don't find corporations saying we have the right to imprison you or punish you and things like that. Only governments make that claim. And in some jurisdictions, not Australia, even to the point where they can deprive you of your life. So I think there's something qualitatively different about government in a modern liberal democratic state, or any state, because of that claim, which doesn't have the corporations. And I think we are justifiably then a little bit nervous about those people who make that claim to say, well, what would you do with this information? In terms of Karina's question about the distinction between public good, common good and the public interest, there are some differences. So common good and the public good are probably interchangeable in some senses. A common good is a particular kind of good which is infinitely dividable and shareable without there being any loss. So to take a very simple example, if you thought of something like a bowl of Smarties and you said, well, there's 100 of them. If I come along and take 51 of them, then there is only 49 left to be distributed. So it's kind of that zero-sum game. But if you take something like friendship, which is a common good, then there might be a room of 100 people. And if I walk in and form a friendship with 99 other people, my doing so doesn't deny you the opportunity also to form friendships with 99 other people. So there are different types of goods. Common goods, or you might call them public goods, have that characteristic. It's not just that it's good for the public, it's a qualitatively different type of good itself. The difference between those, though, and the public interest is more, I think, where you may have been asking about, and that is one has to distinguish between what the public wants, and there are lots of wants that occur in life, versus interests. And the public interest then is around developing those things which, for a political unit like a nation or a state, whatever, are capable of being for the benefit of the whole, rather than being for the partial or private interests of certain individuals or groups. So it doesn't mean that no one has some greater benefit than another, but for it to be in the public interest, it must be directed towards what is good for the public as a whole, rather than just the partial benefit of a few. So I hope that helps to explain some of those distinctions.
Yeah, and actually that makes me, there's some excellent questions here, but this also touches on, I think, Radi, trust and social cohesion, and getting that balance right too. And I do wonder if does the government need to do more in demonstrating that they can be trusted? I guess maybe it's a bit unfair to say that. And just on that, there's the facial recognition and even the future use of data. I sense people are also concerned that, well, if I give this data out now and just look at all the stuff that's happening with Facebook and familial searches and that, where they found the Golden Gate Killer and that, you know, they could store this data for years and then use it later on for other purposes which we have no control or consent over.
Good questions, hard questions to answer. The measurement and understanding of levels in public trust, I guess, is really a difficult one. I think a difficult one to measure. I think you only have to look through, I guess, the lens of COVID-19 and, dare I say, the COVID Safe app, which was downloaded by quite a number of Australians. Not everyone, of course, but a fair part of the population. That was, in essence, was part trust. The government developed an application to help Australians and was downloaded by quite a number of Australians. I think we could do more in terms of educating the public. We have, and you've just seen, I think there was a cyber announcement most recently, which looks towards bolstering government and government's capabilities in cyber. And we have a number of departments, effectively, or agencies that have been set up to help protect our information as well. In terms of trust, very difficult one. Like I was on a seminar just the other day, and they mentioned that real estate agents were trusted more than the government. And that's sort of, you know, a bit of a surprise to me. But you sort of sit back and go, why? And that could be because, I guess, it comes back to that first point, which is the misunderstanding of privacy, I guess, and government maybe, and us being more transparent in the legal frameworks that we have established and how we protect people going forward. I think more could be done there.
Yeah. And this just makes me think about all the things that are happening out there at the moment with algorithms and the like, and a point that you made earlier, Monica. Who should oversee all of this work? You know, the setting of algorithms and making sure that they're ethical and that they're principles based and the like. You know, is that government, and if so, how?
Yeah, I guess it depends where the algorithm is formed and for what purposes too. So it's a challenging question. But I think, you know, going back to the app issue, there has been quite a few people that have downloaded the app. I think that's great. But quite a few people didn't download the app. And if we guess that that's because they trusted government, I'm sorry, Reddy, I'm not sure that's exactly all the reasons why people did. It might have been, and this is just anecdotal, hearing people, because they wanted to do the greater good for the country and thought that'll, even though I don't trust government, I think I will put that aside because this might be for the greater good. And you know, I guess another part of all this is that when we communicate these things, when government communicates these things to people, framing it as I'm going to communicate the legislation to people, people just turn off because most people don't understand legal talk, they don't understand technical talk. So our challenge, I think, is to communicate these things in a way that people can understand them. And if we want people to take on certain behaviours, then we have to teach them how to do those behaviours as well. So in our institute, for instance, in cybersecurity that we're developing, we have a centre at the moment. Those are some of our challenges that we're looking at as researchers and working with industry and government as well, is that how do we actually teach people broadly, not just university students, but also the general public on what technology means, what it can actually do. When our privacy is at threat, when we have a camera on us, we know what can happen, right? We can see it, or we have someone watching us. But when it's about bits of data, we don't know where it goes and in whose hands. And so when we want to trust something, we need to see what's happening. We need to understand that a whole lot better as well.
I think you got to reckon with the fact, Barty, too, that Australians form their view about trust in government almost with a holistic picture. And so when they see things like the sports fraud affair, which the Auditor General's been investigating, and they say, well, look, you've got people here who are willing to take $100 million of taxpayers' money and expend it in order to advance a very partial, that is private interest. And these are the people who are in charge. And they say, oh, well, you know, we're not responsible, no rules were broken or whatever, and they completely obfuscate. The public, they're just not mugs. And so they get a sense and they say, well, if that's how the system's run, where it's actually you take what you can for your own benefit, and these are the people in charge, then we can't trust them with other really important things. We might do as Monica said, where people will say, well, we'll put that aside for the public interest, our commitment. That's been, I think, a really remarkable thing in the last few months is the way in which the fortunate position we find ourselves in relative to other countries is very much a product of citizens consistently doing the right thing. That's been really important. I think that's the problem, and this is why the more powerful technologies become and the more governments want to make use of it, they have to join up their ethics too. So it's not just about the ethics inside the technology. What is the ethical basis of the system? So does the political system and the way it operates have legitimacy in the eyes of its citizens? Does the public sector itself have sufficient freedom, if you like, from government to discharge its obligations to the community as a whole without being politicised when it comes to these matters? And the more people start to say, actually, this system is serving the public interest rather than partial or private interests, the more then I think they trust it as a whole, which is what you want it to do for those times when you really need it. And I think as we look to the future, we're going to increasingly need to have higher levels of trust to manage some of the challenges we face, whether it's through technology or geopolitics or other things, which is why the past 30 years or so of sort of breaking down the ethical infrastructure has been so damaging, because now we pay the price for that.
Well, isn't that what the lawyers refer to as the chilling effect? So there's a cost by misbehaving in a different domain, how that then spills over into other domains. There's the question there from for you, Matt, from Terry L, sorry, about public buy-in, where there seems to be very little collaboration between Australian R&D centres, and this echoes a lot of other questions around Australia's competitiveness and or lack thereof in this space. On the one hand, we don't want it to be a race to the bottom, and we don't, as someone who I think Mark posed a question about social credit score system, are we heading in that direction? But on the other hand, how do we keep up so that we're not, we don't become an economic backwater potentially?
Yeah, good. Yeah, another great question. But I really think it's a mix of things, right? So you need investment, you need governance, you need regulation, we need civil society participation. So we need people to be part of this, and industry support and involvement. And I think picking up on what Monica said before, I think the society-wide education part is really critical to that too. And that's not only so they understand what's going on, but also so that they are prepared to be part of the process as well, and they can be part of the uplift. We have the skills and capabilities, the human capital as a society to take advantage of the opportunities. So look, it's a complex issue, and it's going to obviously take a lot of different levers to pull to sort of get us there. That's right. And I just think it's and it's got to be like a lot of these things. It's a whole holistic response. Picking up on what Radi said before, there was 130 million or billion or whatever dollars put for ASD the other day to help our cyber defences and capability. A lot of the early comment on that from industry has been, well, we just won't see any of that because of the way that these agencies operate, and it's very much a one-way street. They don't tend to share much, but they take a lot. And they're the sorts of things that I think these are the opportunities that these kind of initiatives actually provide to governments. Okay, we're going to put all this money into this agency, but we're going to use that to make sure that we get the connection right to industry. We're supporting local industry to help us do what we need to do. It's a two-way street. We start overcoming those barriers, which the government, particularly security agencies, are very quick to put up, need to know, or it's highly classified, we can't share. We need to find some way to navigate that better. I think we've done some good work, but I think, again, that gets to, there's lots of levers we can pull, and that's another one, I think.
Yeah, and I think there's a couple of questions here I'd like to bring up for you, Radi. So there's one from Jenny about, can you please provide guidance on how individuals can strike that balance between sharing data for public good versus protecting privacy, and I'm thinking about the COVID Safe app. What sort of questions should we be asking, and can we try? So this goes back to Monica's point about education, which really resonates with me. And there's another question here from Smitha, which relates to that, which I think you should be able to see. Are there initiatives by the government focused on increasing public awareness about managing their data? I don't know about you, Radi, but I've never sat down and read one of those end user license agreements that go for pages and pages. I think I started through the first paragraph and then I.
Sorry, I actually can't see the question for some reason, but the first one was just in regards to, just remind me, sorry,
So that's how. So it's a great question, I think, from Jenny, because she's asking, how can individuals strike that balance between sharing their data for public good versus protecting privacy? And obviously that goes with education, but also awareness. And I think something else that, Simon, I know is very close to your heart is about control over that data. And what sort of questions should we be asking?
I'm not sure about the questions we should be asking. I think, how do we strike the balance? Oh goodness.
I guess
I think I put forward before, like, there is this sort of balance between privacy and convenience that needs to be struck, and it's not just government. I think it's private sector as well. We want to go through airports, and I'd use the airport example because it's one that we're pretty close to. We want to be able to walk through airports seamlessly. And what we mean by that is we want a fair level of convenience. We don't necessarily want to be lining up for 2 to 3 hours. And we want to ensure that we sort of get on the plane safely as well. So striking that balance between the two is really difficult. We're reliant on quite a lot of data and information. And some of that comes from the images that are caught when you go up to a kiosk or the gate and your passport. So it requires your face and your facial biometric. The notion of, and I do take that note of, education is quite important for us. And yes, it could be done better. We've got I think we raised this before, we have a chief medical officer within government who clearly articulated the health impacts of COVID. And the real question is, what would be the equivalent within government? I think it's probably a question for other panel members and their take on it. How could government do that better? But not just government, the private sector as well. So the balance is, it comes back to that convenience and privacy piece, I think, is the real thing. And we are challenged by it. So.
And I guess what appeals to me about the question from Jenny is she's sort of putting the onus a bit back on the individual. But I guess that comes back to having the information available and having the education to be able to make those judgment calls.
Yeah. But when you think about wanting to walk through, take the example about the airport. It's true you do want to have reasonably convenient and unimpeded progress. But at the same time, you don't want to be the person who's stopped because of the colour of your skin or your religion and algorithmic bias, which has been one of the problems here. I'm not saying that human beings aren't biased. We clearly are. But we often take these data sets and we don't interrogate them clearly enough. And particularly if you've got an unsupervised neural network, which is starting to do some of the more sophisticated assessments, where you can't even precisely put the point of where it's gone wrong. So the transformation in data sets, the way they talk to each other, you can find unjust outcomes coming through. So it's not just convenience versus control. It's also, is it a fair and equitable process which doesn't stereotype people where they are unjustly being impeded so that the rest of us can go through? That would be a problem as well. So I think this is why it's so difficult. It's not that these aren't goods that we could secure. It's how do we get the maximum good, if you like, at the minimum detriment, which comes through that. And I think that's where the design question comes in. I noticed that one of the questions that was asked about should there be some kind of a consumer control of consumer choice is in choice editing, like some supermarkets do, where they only put certain things. I actually think that with some of these technologies, we should have, maybe answering Radi's point, something like the equivalent of the Therapeutic Goods Administration, where with pharmaceuticals, we know that we're not going to release them to the Australian public unless they're safe and effective. So we trial them. We make sure that they're going to do what they're supposed to without these unintended consequences, or at least we understand it. Maybe there are other forms of technology that we ought to be thinking about similarly in terms of how they come to market, so that we know that they work and that they are safe. And I think part of that will be around radical transparency in terms of how they've been designed. So now we start to raise issues around IP and protection and things like that. But being able to see inside the box, anybody being able to make sure that it hasn't brought about some unintended consequences for reasons that others could have identified will be another safeguard.
What are your thoughts, Monica?
I actually wanted to pick up on Radi's point on the COVID issue and the medical officer, because I really enjoyed you thinking about that, Radi, because I think it's a really good example of medical stuff is hard for the general public to understand, and so is technical stuff, right? And if we want people to change behavior, we have to understand it, but we need a person in authority that is an expert to explain that to us, because we trust people who are in authority, right, as well. So it's not just about, oh, government, we don't trust what they do. It's also that, if you don't have that voice that has the expertise, then you're less likely to comply with behavior. So when we look at the medical experts across the country, we had we even had an image of what this thing looks like that nobody can see, right? That helped us understand it a bit more, with these little tentacles that can get us. And this idea that, giving us this distance of how far we need to be apart and giving us actionable advice. This is what we need to do. And so that's helped us change behavior. So we can look at that with technology as well, having a person in authority that we trust and that explains things to us. And that might be the app, but that might be other things as well. In my own research, when I've looked at people who look at government websites for help on scams, and in the best will of the world, that's a great thing to do. And to be fair, this was UK research. I found that those people were more likely to be scammed than people that hadn't looked at those sites. So it's not just about that information, but how we convey it and how we give that advice as well. That is really, it's not easy to do, and it's really great to hear that government are thinking about that as well.
It's you're great point, Monica, and I think it reminds me of the not so great public messaging of metadata when Abbott and Brandis tried to talk about it as being the address that's written on the front of the envelope, but not the data, not the letter that's inside or something. So I think the government can probably do a lot better than that in terms of trying to educate public, and that's probably not a bad example of how things could be.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I guess just picking up on that, I think a couple of points there. I think is it just government that should do it? What is the onus of large corporations, Google's, the AWS's, the others that I guess I think there's also a notion that there should be something there as well. But I think just picking up on Simon's point as well, I think there's great benefit, and technology is moving so quickly that creating a safe playground, and I think that's probably not the right term, but a place where we, and I speak on behalf of government and maybe others, industry as well, can actually trial technologies under guiding principles in a way that we could test before actually release. Easier said than done, but there is that, and I know there's been some discussion in regards to that in government. I think that would need an industry and government solution for it to work. But I think there's something in that in terms of trial before we buy effectively. We don't currently necessarily have that set up.
Do we run the risk of, again, as you say, technology moves so quick, and we're already, I think, behind a lot of other countries in that regard? I guess, or maybe the question is, how do we get that balance to not put undue obstacles and blockers in front of industry to continue to be competitive and evolve and develop new technologies, but also you want to ensure safety for the public? I mean, I guess that's a $64 million question.
Well, you're answering your own question, really. I mean, the point is you don't want to put in undue blocks, but equally, you can be very rapid at doing some really stupid things. And being quick to market with a bad idea is good for everybody else, I suppose, if you're the only one who's affected. But some of these technologies are so powerful that they do have secondary effects on people, and I don't think it's fair to sacrifice prudence. So what my argument has always been, let's go as fast as we can, get the principles right, do the innovation, put the accountability on people, skill up the technologists and those behind them to be able to manage these ethical issues as well, so that they're not having to go through a series of gates and sort them down. But Radi's right, it's not a job just for government. This is a job for industry too. And what they know is that the prize is if they build it in at the beginning, if they are careful in the way they're doing it, then they will, and others are having to operate within the same basic sandpit that Radi described, then what you're going to do is you will still be fast and you'll still be innovative, because no one's going to stop you from thinking about new solutions to problems. It's just that you'll be within a framework so that you're not going to be doing a lot of damaging to completely innocent third parties along the way. We want to minimise, if you like, the collateral damage that innovation can bring if it is completely unbridled.
Yeah.
Well, and raises so private sector is obviously a key player in all of this, and there's a question there, Radi, for you about Zoom and social media, which makes me think of that. There was something in the press just recently about Border Force officers using social media to help make decisions or determinations, I should say, about whether someone can come into the country. But there's also the other complexity here is other governments. I've actually worked. I worked for an English company some years ago, and this was after just around the GFC, and we had to put a global program on hold because we were using a US company to implement a new general ledger across all our 60 countries. And the reason it was put on hold is because the Americans pulled out the Patriot Act and said, we want to look at your data, to which the UK regulated bank said, well, no, that's not right. So there's, I mean, I don't know. I mean, TikTok, there's another question there about that too, which is, again, owned by another foreign country. So, but yeah, do you have any comments or thoughts on that, Radi?
Data sovereignty is a hot topic at present, and like it comes back to that point, which is my kids who are quite young engage with TikTok daily. Hundreds and hundreds of videos. I just can't believe it. And Zoom, again, not owned by Australian, and this information may not even be stored in Australia. Really is a hot topic for government at the moment. We are looking at the Cloud Act. And I don't know enough about the Cloud Act, but it is around all data sovereignty and where information should be stored and how it can be accessed. And it is something that we do need to resolve pretty quickly, because it could hold back some innovation. It could hold back, and this is a classic example. We're using Zoom at the moment. We're engaging with Zoom. And there aren't that many other products that are available in Australia, and there might be a few that enable us to connect. So I think, hard question to answer, but it is a topic of discussion at the moment.
What do you think, Matt? Is there an industry here that we should be developing in Australia because of this, or is that an overreaction? Because again, I agree with everything that everyone says, and what Simon was saying about principles-based. Problem is, if we can't enforce it, then, and again, if that, to Monica's point, if the data's out there and someone else owns it, then that can cause problems down the track. Yeah,
it's really complex, isn't it? Like, I think there's been lots of talk about an ethical framework for AI that industry should adopt, and I don't know how far that's got. Simon might know better on that. And then I guess the question then becomes, how can you, not enforce but ensure that it's adopted widely? I think the other real question is, and ultimately the question about data ownership. I mean, if who owns it? And there was a quote I read the other day about someone talked about data rights being human rights. So you should own your data, no matter where it's put. But if a platform like, Facebook or so, or TikTok or whatever provides a service, you are implicitly or explicitly agreeing to provide basically data for use of it for free of charge, then what rights do you have on its further use? It's such a tricky issue, and you can see it from the commercial point of view, but you can also see it from the private point of view, which probably brings us right back to where we started on those ethical guidelines, or ways of acting that sort of we need to, as a society, embrace, and the industry is embrace as well.
Yeah, but I don't think it's that complicated thing to get our minds around in terms of systems design. So, I'm looking at vehicles going backwards and forwards in the street outside where I'm sitting at the moment. In Australia, if you want to sell a motor vehicle, a new one, it has to meet certain emission standards in terms of we have no problem with that. Similarly with safety standards, it's got to have certain levels of construction. Otherwise, you just simply cannot sell these things. And we go back and we take our cars in above a certain age, and we get to check that they're still safe and that the tyres are right when we go to register and things of that kind. So we've built systems for other things that we have. Electricity and other things, again, safety and efficiency, pharmaceuticals. There's a million examples I could give you. So it's not hard to imagine what you do. The question is, do you have the will to do it? And because it's a new technology, of course, we haven't said, well, why don't we just apply some of these things in a more obvious way? I think the more interesting thing, though, is in that latter part about what is the actual future of data itself in terms of aggregation versus disaggregation. And I think that there are some really profound changes that may come about because of an intersection of different technologies. So, for example, you've got people like Tim Berners-Lee and others that are now working quite hard to look at how could you create a series of private clouds. Now, it might seem counterintuitive that you have private clouds. Isn't the whole point about this to have distributed computing and all the rest? But if you think of your data as something that you own and that you only release under terms that you agree to, it might be a use case like a change of address, where rather than having to write to a million different people, you say, a change of address, everybody who's connected to my private cloud can automatically be advised of that. Then there's a really potent use case that everybody understands as to why you would do that. But in another situation, it might be information about you that others want to take and then derive from that commercial value. And I think one of the really interesting possibilities is that the discussion about data, at least, and its intersection with AI is quite likely to move from being a debate about privacy rights or liberty rights to a question of economic rights. Because if AI and other forms of automation begin to displace people from employment, rather than being rewarded for selling their labour, which is how you earn income, it might be that your data is the one thing of economic value that you've got. And you will start to see people saying, well, they don't want to employ me, but they want to use my information. They want to take it and transform it like they do with raw materials. So, clearly mining companies have to pay for the iron ore. They pay royalties. They do all sorts of other things. They then transform it, gets turned into steel. Maybe data starts to look like that, particularly if it's derived from individuals. And you begin to have a movement which is not just driving now economics, but also will have political impact, because you've got people who are saying, well, the most valuable thing I have is my information. They will insist that governments protect it and give them the kind of legal rights to protect those economic rights that emerge. Now, if this happens, and I know I'm speculating about a world which is not yet realised, that has very, very profound challenges for this whole debate. And my concern is that we're not even thinking about this yet to really develop what were the frameworks that would anticipate such a profound change.
I actually don't think you're thinking about a future too far off. So, I mean, I've read some examples recently of companies in the States that actually set up explicitly for people to offer their data, and then they had entered into agreement to then give them, probably a few cents every, megabyte or whatever every time they sell it. So,
it's been around for about 10 years, this development. But what I think is that this is another area which is outstripping, if you like, our policy thinking and our institutional arrangements.
It's I think it's already here, and I'm a keen cyclist actually, and I follow the Tour de France and all the rest, and Chris Froome and all these fantastic cyclists. And daily they collect information on how they train, their heart rate, their speed, their calorie intake, and everything about them. And interestingly enough, that data is owned by the company or the team. And it's impacting trades and they know when someone's starting to peak and when they're not. And it's not the data that Chris Froome or a cyclist can take with them. The corporation, the team owns it. So it's happening now.
And Monica, I mean, to pick up on a point Simon made too, so we can measure, I like that example, we can measure exhaust emissions and things like that and safety and so forth. It's a little harder. I'm sort of scratching my head a bit to think, well, how do we measure, say, the psychological impacts of misusing this data so that we can make these informed decisions?
Yeah, that's a really good point. Often that's just completely neglected in all of this. And I guess where I started talking today was the advantages, but also the disadvantages. So to give some direct examples from my work of scam victims as individuals, and then you can look at business as well. But when they lose money, often the psychological harm outweighs that money quite a lot, and we get quite a lot of suicides, for example. You can look at that with harassment, and you can look at that as something that is life-changing. So we talk about people that have been in an accident and a life-changing injury. The same things for the psychological harms that can happen, whether that be harassment, bullying, scams, etc. So and I do think that government do need to pick up a little bit more on this to protect citizens as well on all that, beyond the financial issues there for sure. And again, you look at, there's some organizations in this country that are trying to help people on this level, like ID Care, for instance, who are doing a fantastic job. But there are just so many victims out there that we need to work on this. So yeah, psychological harm's massive. How do we support people? We don't do that anywhere near as well as we should. So yeah, definitely.
Yeah, and it makes me think of other countries that use measures like, I think Nepal, gross national happiness, and I think that's been adopted now by some of these measures. I think have been adopted by the UN as recently as 2017. So perhaps a lot of this, and there's a question here too. It's about from Mike, is that are we looking at this the wrong way? Should we be saying no, instead of having a discussion around ethics versus progress, it's like, how do we use ethics to ensure we get the right sort of progress? And I guess that raises the question is, well, what is progress? Is it just financial? Is it just monetary? Are there other aspects of this too, and social cohesion that we need to look at, as well as psychological benefits? I mean, corporations are trying to move away from the standard sort of bottom line measure to, quadruple bottom lines with, community and all sorts of things, and the environment included in those measures.
Yeah, and you know what, I think it's important for us to also focus on the positives here, as you were just alluding to, right? Because we can harness this big data and the internet and other things for our gains as well, right? So it's a matter of balancing that. And I think Simon has explained really nicely about the ethical principles in technology, but looking at the psychological aspects as well. And of course, when technology is developed, it's done by a team, right? So it's not just done by technical people. You've got a team of psychologists, you've got a team of ethicists. You do have those people together. And so it's a matter of perhaps people like Simon and others, developing these guidelines that we need to really think about and get right. How is it going to be helpful for people's health and well-being? How is it going to be useful to protect them? How are we going to make sure that we don't have the continual issue of the digital divide as well, right? So even if we've got all this access, some people may want to sell off their data at some point. It's that because they're not well off and they need that to survive. Is that the right thing for us to do, right? So already we know that a lot of research on the digital divide with children is that they may have the same access, but they use it in different ways because they're not shown how to use it to their advantage. So I think we need to look at those issues as well.
I think if you look at issues, and this relates to what Monica's been talking about around human well-being, there are many epidemiological studies going back to studies of the British Civil Service or suicide rates on the Tiwi Islands. And what people find over and over again is that the mental and physical health and well-being of people is intimately connected to the sense in which they feel they have some control over their lives. It almost invariably fails if you just try and address the technical issues that might seem to be there around notions of whether you have access to particular goods or not. If you don't also give people a sense that they have some control over their lives. So this is why things like colonisation can be so devastating to Indigenous communities or wherever it occurs, or where people are in heavily hierarchic structures where there's no choice over their lives. You see differential health outcomes. Now, when we know that, if we're thinking, well, what we want to do is to have all of this technology that we're developing for the benefit of humanity, not to make life worse off. So we want, yes, convenience and efficiency, but we also need to reckon with the fact that however we do it, we give people the sense that this isn't all just being done to them. It's bad enough when things are done to you by a human being and you can actually see their face, but if it's being done to you by an amorphous algorithm somewhere in the cloud and you don't really have much of an understanding of why it's doing or what it's doing, then the destructive nature of that for human beings is very, very considerable. I think if we take what we know about these sorts of studies in the past, and Monica may wish to contribute more about this because I'm really talking in her area, I think then we can start to think, well, we can design it. We've talked a bit about how politics has to be designed in a way so it operates as a kind of ethical infrastructure that supports innovation rather than undermining it by destroying trust. You want to have industry thinking about how it innovates, but within a framework so that the community can trust it and give it as much speed as it can safely be done. You want to think about the design of the system itself so that human beings are not reduced to being just network elements within a system, but their intrinsic dignity is recognised and they're given some sense of control over their lives. We know how to do this. It's just whether or not we have the presence of mind to actually do it.
Did you want to add to that, Monica?
Sure. I guess, I mean, there's a lot to psychological well-being and definitely control is part of it. Another part of it is actually support, right? So that could be social support from your networks and from others as well to when difficulties happen and also for enjoyment in life. So there's all sorts of ways that these things could perhaps be developed and thinking about that. But I think, this idea that Simon raised about control is interesting because I think the problem for people, as I've talked about before, is they don't know what's really happening. So they imagine it and sometimes they might catastrophize it because you just don't get it, right? And so it's about really helping the nation really get it. And also because, a lot of the stuff we do in cybersecurity in our centre is also about how do people protect their devices and all the rest from, because it's not just about privacy with government, it's also about criminals attacking us and taking our data, right? And so how do we actually manage to up people's understandings about this instead of arousing their fears too much? Because when you arouse fears, people don't take action. They just think it's too hard for me to understand, I don't do anything about it. So how do we communicate these issues that people understand and then can make choices because they get it?
There's a really good precedent for something like this from Germany. And again, it goes back to the early days of genetically modified organisms. The Germans saw the scandal that came out of the Monsanto case and others. And so the government said, well, what we'll do is we'll run a thing called Die Frage, 1,000 questions. And they basically put up billboards all across Germany. They said, what do you want to know about GMOs? Ask us 1,000 questions and we'll give you 1,000 answers. So rather than guessing, if you like, what the public really was worried about or interested in, they said, let's ask them. And I think it might be interesting if Australia was to do something similar, where we ask the community, well, here's the technology, what sort of interests or concerns or whatever, and as Monica has said, you don't want them just catastrophizing this future and having a dystopian view because out of total ignorance, but you might find that they'll ask the questions and you can very easily answer them, and then people say, phew, I can let go of that now and I can move on and actually engage more constructively in what might be possible.
Sorry.
You go, Monica.
I was just thinking, you're right, opening up those communication channels is right. I'm not sure that we all know what questions to ask yet, but if we start that opening up, I think that's really good, because at the moment people are told, use your VPN, you know, make sure you patch immediately. And they think, why? But it's like, I can't see anything happening. Why is that important? And then when something goes wrong, then they're all blamed for this, right? And so actually, I think, you know, some of that idea of actually asking, you know, people, what concerns do you have? What do you need to know? That may be one way of starting that communication happening, rather than assuming. I think we've started a baseline of assuming everyone gets something, but actually lots of people don't, and they get their information from lots of other people who probably don't as well. So yeah,
Monica, I guess question: how do we do that, and who? And I know government plays a part in that, and Scam Watch and other things like that. So we've got websites and other things, but I guess how do we do that?
Well, I invite you to work with us as researchers too, because that's some of the work that we're trying to do at the moment. And actually, off this webinar, we can chat a little bit more, because one of the things that, as a group actually at University of New South Wales, is that we're interested in educating the nation about this, and not just university students, and actually trying to get that right, and working with you guys, because it's about bringing it to a level that they understand the language that they understand, and actually helping them and answering those questions in the way they understand, but also getting people invested and interested in this too, right? Because if they think, oh, well, it's not my problem, then they're not going to even listen in the first place. So we need to get that happening too.
And really that comes back to somewhat of the medium of communication as well, because I know that we do a lot online, websites and advertisements and other things like that, but I guess there's maybe different ways of looking at it as well.
Yeah. And, you know, so part of the problem too is we talked about trust with government already, right? So maybe it's not just at the point of government that we educate them, even though it's really important that, you know, that happens there. I think we need to think about in all our activities in terms of being safe. So for instance, you know, when we log on to a consumer site, maybe there should be some responsibility, and Simon could talk to that, about how do we protect ourselves when we're on that site. Because when you go to shop, for instance, you don't go, oh, I'll go and check that government website and make sure I get it right. And when you go to do dating, you don't do that in real life. So it's about where we're going to get that information. And then I think if we're going to survey the nation and find out, you know, what do they know, what do they need to know, which is actually a project we're trying to get up at New South at the moment, then I think it kind of has to show a little bit of separation sometimes from government because of that problem of trust, but then it can feed back to government as well.
Yeah.
And look, we're nearly out of time, but I think I've got so many questions buzzing around in my head, and there's so many questions we've still got to that still have I think we've addressed most of them. There's still some questions surfacing around what I would say is our competitive differences between other countries or jurisdictions like the US and China. One thing I do want to touch on though before we finish up, Radi, this is probably again for you. It's and this sort of ties together a few of the strands that we've touched on so far. Is that around you know, control involves a certain amount of explainability, and I think Bill Gates has been quoted as saying that we always overestimate the amount of change that's going to happen in the next 2 years, but underestimate that which is going to happen in the next 10 years. So with AI and big data and all the zettabytes of data that's sort of coming down the pike, which is already here, we seem to be, are we rapidly heading to a place where it's going to be harder and harder to offer explanations as to why someone did get a bank loan or why someone can't come into the country. And again, this is real time, I think, I feel.
Yeah, a challenge that we are faced with right now. So I guess I can provide that through the lens of someone wanting to come into the country to visit or to live, the visa application, a migration application. We have systems in place that use predictive analytics, that use machine learning, other bits and pieces, and draw from various different sources of information to bring things together effectively. But there is always a human involved in the decision. And that is the stance that we've taken going forward. The next 5 to 10 years that will be challenged. I guess when we've got cars that drive themselves, and we've sort of stepped into that sort of era, it'll be looked at again. But for now, and it's one that we're grappling with because we've got lots of data and information being provided by flight operators, cargo companies, and others. That at the end of the day, we have taken the stance internally of letting a human make that decision. And that's quite important going forward. Will that be the future? I think that's where we're challenged over the next 5 years or more.
Agreed. And looking on that note, Radi Kovacevic, thank you very much for your time. Professor Monica Whitty, again, it's been a pleasure. And Dr. Simon Longstaff, I'd really like to sit down and have a glass or two of wine with you at some point. And Matt Wilson, thank you all for your contributions. I hope that we can do some more in this space, and I hope it's answered a few questions out there, or at least provided some food for thought. And look, I'd like to also thank the people behind the scenes, so Annabelle and Jennifer and the other Monica. Thank you very much. It's been a lot of fun. And on behalf of University of New South Wales, Canberra, and UNSW more broadly, and Downer Group, I'd like to thank all of our speakers for sharing your knowledge and expertise with us today. This session has been recorded and will be shared via email with everyone who registered for today's event. And we look forward to seeing you or hearing from you at future UNSW events.
Look forward to having additional